Thank you all very much for coming out today. I want to thank Bob for coming this evening to do our talk. And I also want to thank the Community Club for the use of this building, and for Cat TV for coming out tonight to film the event. After we're done, one of our members suggested that we ask around. We'd like to know how people heard about this and what social media, whatever they heard about it on. Bob is an expert on the Battle of Bennington and a local historian, and tonight he's going to be talking about Shaftsbury and the Revolutionary War, so I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to turn it over to you. You ready?
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to this special presentation of the Shaftsbury, Vermont Historical Society. Let's go way back in time to our earliest days. We will be studying Bennington and Shaftsbury's development, which was initiated by the Robinson family. I will be discussing the Battle of Bennington, also the border feud between New York and Vermont, initially called the New Hampshire Grants. What was the Shaftsbury Munitions House used for? How did Shaftsbury and Bennington become the birthplace of Vermont? Were there loyalists as well as patriots in Shaftsbury? I will reveal much new scholarship and information on both questions. My name is Bob Hoare, and I grew up in Shaftsbury. Technical difficulties? Bear with us. Okay. My name is Bob Hoare, and I grew up in Shaftsbury. And there is going to be a picture of little me in the Amos Huntington House in West Shaftsbury. That house is on Myers Road, and it was built in 1782. Amos was a captain in the Shaftsbury militia. He was captured at the Battle of Hubbardton in 1776 by the German troops. Amos was at many of the Green Mountain Boys confrontations that we're going to discuss here today. Okay? So there have been several books written about Shaftsbury. None of these books are about the settlement of the town, or the Battle of Bennington, or divided loyalties in the Revolutionary War. This research about the story of Shaftsbury will explore the many different types of settlers in Shaftsbury. We will especially be exploring the locations of some houses, house sites, and events. Okay, we're going to just carry on with some of this narrative. We're going to talk about New York for a second here. James II helped to create New York by conquering the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam in the 1600s. The British also took control of the global slave trade as well at that time. This was centered in New York City. James also revoked colonial authority and hunted the killers of King Charles, who were then hiding in Connecticut. There were border adjustments as British New York sought to expand. Long Island was given to New York, and Connecticut gained the New Haven colony. Yep, keep going. Yeah, that's perfect. No, go back two. Oh, we have the wrong one up there. Okay, I think we may have the wrong presentation behind me, but let's see how we do. Okay, try going forward one. Okay, many years later, a political rival of King James would be the namesake of Shaftsbury. Anthony Ashley Cooper helped to found the rival Whig Party, which was anti-slavery. He was involved with the exclusion crisis in England, which was an attempt to exclude Catholics from the monarchy. New England charter governments would become Whigs politically, while for the purposes of our story, New York will be considered loyal Tories. Okay? The English Civil Wars were mirrored in the colonies. So the well-known feud of New England and New York over the border was actually rooted in the English Civil Wars. I'm going to do a quote here. No matter how detached the Puritan settlements may have been from the English Civil War, in Royalist eyes they were guilty of collaboration with Republicans who wanted to end monarchy, and even with regicides who had killed King Charles I. The New Englanders' efforts to control their internal affairs could thereafter be construed as threats to royal authority. As corporate persons, chartered colonies took over the role of the overmighty subject who the king must control to assure his sovereignty. Try another one. Try another one. One more. All right, let's go with this. The French and Indian War is the beginning for most historians to describe the Revolution and the war. After that war, taxation of the colonies became a heated debate. This is the beginning of our national identity. The Stamp Act of 1764 and its repeal emboldened the colonists and those along the border. Cadwallader Colden was the New York governor. He was actually active in the earlier border feud with Connecticut in the 1930s that led to some adjustments, okay? He would become the focus of the Stamp Act riots in New York City as he was very loyal to the king's policies. So you got that political cartoon there. It would be Colden who convinced the king to make the Connecticut River the border, giving Vermont to New York in 1764. You see it says New York government over our map of Vermont there. These events were all related to royal control over the colonies like the king had never done before. The king would expunge the Whig Party and all the placement in positions of power and replace them with Tories. This is exactly what happened with Benning Wentworth. How did Bennington find itself battling a royal colony which was attempting to expand its territory? The border feud between Massachusetts and New York had been fought over before, and it was in the process of being settled at the 20-mile line through private negotiation. This is the best map to understand the border after the French and Indian War. It's called the Cantonment of Forces in North America by Patterson in 1765. So you can see Vermont was considered to be a part of New England until Cadwallader Colden convinced the king to have the border to be the Connecticut River. Another quote here is, according to the lawyer historian William Smith, his province claimed, in a word, all the country belonging to the crown of Great Britain not already granted, for we are to consider New York among her sister colonies as a residuary legatee. This is the lotting plan for Bennington, which was charted in 1749. Notice the many lots that were given to the Williams family. It is divided in 64 equal parts, with a town lot included there in the center. Bennington staked the 20-mile claim for a border with New York for all of Benning Wentworth's 130 towns. The death of Ephraim Williams seems to end the Williams family interest in Bennington and the 20-mile line controversy, but it did not. The town was sold to the Robinson family of Hardwick, Massachusetts. They were future evangelist Christians seeking religious freedom. This lotting plan also includes many important New Englanders, just as New York claims and patents would include many prominent figures, okay? So overall, land grant size to individuals is being subverted by everyone. So that's one of the things going on this lotting map here. Did the Williams family set up others in this border feud? Here's another quote for me here. Maybe try going forward. Forward. My father went up in summer with a retinue of Indians and disbanded soldiers headed by a land surveyor. In that country, men of this description formed an important and distinct profession. They were provided with an apparatus of measuring chains, tents, and provisions. It was upon the whole an expensive expedition. But this was the less to be regretted as the subject proved fully adequate. Never was a location more fertile or more valuable, nor the possessor of an estate more elated with his acquisition. That's a quote from Anne Grant, Memoirs of an American Lady. The actual settlers to Bennington bought rights, not lots. This was different than in Bennington, in that lots were not divided early. The Robinsons had once owned 3/4 of Shaftsbury. The first settlers go unnamed until they sold in some instances. So it's difficult to get a clear picture of the early settlers. There would have been settlers without title, as the titles were recorded in sporadic town meetings. Were some of these men squatting? People squatting? New York would say so. So this would become a problem. Did some people buy on contingency from the Robinsons only to have the border ruling upend the whole situation? I think we went a little too far, that's okay. So the irregular map was made in 1932 from town records. Shaftsbury was laid out in 4 divisions. Each right gave you a lot in each division. The original lots are not in sequence. Shaftsbury settlers may have actually chosen plots, which is called pitching, or traded them. Each town in Vermont is very different about how they distributed the land. Okay? So did surveying disagreements in Shaftsbury eventually affect the land grant feud with New York? I'm going to do another quote here. Go forward. Another one? Oh, I don't know. We're a little messed up with our narrative and our PowerPoint right here. So we're talking about a petition to Governor Colden. So it's a rare document, and it's one of our earliest documents about Shaftsbury. And it's dated 1765 from the settlers of Shaftsbury, and it was supposed to be to allowing them to keep their claims to their lands without interference from New York. Written 3 years after Shaftsbury's settlement, this document purports to describe everyone in town in an effort to persuade New York authorities to refrain from pressing their claims. So I was just quoting Ruth Levin from our very famous Ordinary Heroes book. So concerning this petition, I disagree. So I believe that Ordinary Heroes did not even consider the possibility that Ebenezer Cole was a Yorker or a Loyalist, okay? So Ebenezer Cole was a land surveyor. He was also earlier a lieutenant in the New York militia. He worked for New York surveyors between the years 1760 and 1763, and this coincides with his land grant purchase and arrival in Shaftsbury in 1765. Shaftsbury had been surveyed by Alexander Colden, the son of New York's governor. It appears that Ebenezer Cole had bought a New Hampshire title, perhaps because it was cheaper, even though he's from New York, okay? So he arrived here with the settlers of Dover, New York, who were the members of his Baptist church there. That's why I had that picture of Connecticut there. He took a leading role in communicating with New York and allowing the New York governor to confirm his grant in any way that the New York governor chose. So this story is very different than what has been told before concerning Ebenezer Cole and that petition. Ebenezer actually advised those with New Hampshire grants not to settle in Shaftsbury. And it was asserted that he was attempting to confirm New Hampshire title, which now seems unlikely because all the events that happened were very different, okay, than what was said in the Ordinary Heroes book, okay? Try the next one. That was the petition I was just talking about. Try the next one. I like that. So the Shaftsbury Munitions House. This is really the main character, Ebenezer Cole and his house in our story today. So this is on Buck Hill Road. It was built in 1765. Other sources say 1770. So the difference is important because I think there's a lot of story in that first 5 years. It has a plank door. It has no basement, and it may have been built without the chimneys. The beams of the house are actually reused. In back, may have been, or once was, a barn door. Helen Olney would say that it was built for food storage, not munitions. The quarry for the stones for this house is right there on the hillside. For me, this house is like a fort. It may have had a log palisade or a wall around it for defense, possibly defense against the Indians. There's a more recent picture by Helen Olney. Go forward one more. Keep going. See where we're going to end up. Okay. So there's a map of soldiers' grants that we're not being shown right now. So the map of soldiers' grants that I show in a couple other slides has been little studied by historians, okay? So you may have heard of the Williamsack patent. What this map shows are a bunch of land grants to British soldiers, okay? And the size of these grants was according to their rank. Almost 95% of them were sold to speculators who were accumulating large amounts of land. Of the 312 soldiers' grants, only 5 remained or succeeded. Ebenezer Cole was a leader in Shaftsbury, as he had been a leader of that group from Dover, New York. His petition to Colden resulted in a meeting in New York after the stamp crisis and delay was over in 1767. At the meeting, Cole succeeded in getting the government to let him have their lands, himself and Robinson's and 7 or 8 others, without paying the fees, which are very infamous, that the Vermonters had to pay more fees to New York to keep their lands, okay? Cole would then take a magistrate role. Is there evidence for a split between Shaftsbury and Bennington? Well, it seems that Robinson's petition to the king had been considered an obstacle at this time by Cole, as did Bennington's non-cooperation with New York. So here's a couple of quotes about this. We're getting some religion talk now. The most outstanding instance of how separates established themselves on the frontier is at Bennington. Bennington's separate church sought to routinize Whitefieldian revivalism. Bennington's settlement should have been a landmark event in the history of Congregationalism. Okay, so there's a very interesting religious settlement that's going to go through some turbulent times, okay? So we have a picture here. Where was the first church in Shaftsbury? Here is a Google image of the Grandview Cemetery, which was associated with the church. The church was located to the north of the cemetery. We also know that a store of supplies was kept by the church to help members in need. Could the Shaftsbury Munitions House have this origin? Bliss Willoughby was another early leader who brought settlers to town. He had met Robinson and made a plan to do this. His initial relationship to Ebenezer Cole is unclear, but he did become a Baptist once he came to Shaftsbury. So according to the customs of the time, there were several preachers in Shaftsbury for the same people, and eventually 3 different churches by 1782. Some of the preachers were Thomas Madison, Ithamar Hibbard, Caleb Blood, and Cyprian Downer. Unlike the settlement pattern for most Vermont towns, I assert that Bennington and Shaftsbury, and to some extent Pownell, was a religious separatist colony. The failure was in keeping it up. Internal divisions would eventually bring Bennington and future Vermont to the brink of failure, and it was really Bliss Willoughby who may have been the decisive character in this story. So also in this picture is schoolhouse number 1. So the house just north of that, in that diagram. The beams from the First Baptist Church were used in that schoolhouse, okay? And the church stood on the corner there. Also, I don't know if you know it, Elm Street and Lamb Road there was once a well-traveled east-west route before the railroad was put in and sort of blocked you from getting over to Route 67, okay? So Bennington owed its settlement to George Whitefield by the way of Samuel Robinson and Bliss Willoughby. That's a picture of George Whitefield, okay? Massachusetts at this time was a virtual theocracy. The Puritan church ruled over everyday affairs. Robinson and these emerging New Light Congregationalists or future evangelicals wanted a pure church without corruption and things like adult baptism and a personal connection with God. Poison pancake. We don't have time for that. Next. Okay. Ooh, we don't have the right thing here. Let's go to Shaftesbury Hollow. Has an interesting and slightly separate history. It was settled as a Scottish manor. Included a manor house, 100 tenants, grain and lumber mills, a nail factory, an ashery, and a pottery. There was a 50-foot tall beaver dam and 30 acres cleared by them. The Lord Duncan McVicker, you can see on the map, Duncan McVicker with a white highlight around it, became frustrated with the land grant controversy and hired a former soldier to lead his settlement. John Monroe would seem to be a placeman for the New York claimants to the land. His house was built precisely on the border. I'll show you that later. Monroe would become the official who most often confronted the Green Mountain Boys for New York. And McVicker Grant's interesting book reveals details about Shaftsbury before white settlers. And so this is that soldiers' grant map that I was talking about. Okay, so soldiers' grants covered Shaftsbury after Shaftsbury had been granted by the governor of New Hampshire. And there's Anne Grant McVicker. And she wrote a book about Albany and Dutch settlements when she was a teenager and then went back to Scotland. So those are the soldiers' grants that covered Shaftsbury, and that's my imprecise close-up of the Southier map of the soldiers' grants. Who was John Small? Who was Dr. Mallet? How did Cole eventually acquire this land? Aha! A lost painting or two reveals the connections between Thomas Gage and members of his senior staff being granted land in Shaftsbury in 1765. This timing coincides with Gage being assigned to New York City as the overall commander-in-chief for the colonies and the Stamp Act, which intended, among other things, to regulate these land grants. The New York governor and assembly would barely slow down. So, would Samuel Robinson's petition for 45 townships on behalf of New Hampshire, was that, it was considered absurd by Governor Henry Moore. Did that result in the particular choice of Thomas Gage's staff as recipients for the regranting of the settled part of these lands? So it's there's a whole group of paintings having to do with the men who had been granted land in Shaftsbury. Right. Right. The figurehead of the military grants, the well-connected Major John Small. He was a leader of the Scottish Black Watch, which had lost in the failed assault on the French lines at Fort Ticonderoga in the French and Indian War. John Small had likely been through Bennington before it was settled. He was a builder of the Crown Point Road, which went across central Vermont from Crown Point to New Hampshire. There's a possibility the East Road, which goes from Fort Massachusetts in North Adams over the old military road in Pownell through Bennington and Shaftsbury to Crown Point, may have also been built by him or his associates. John Small, it is said by many historians, was at the Albany ejectment trials in 1771 defending his soldier's grant. Sources point to him being in New York City and that he did not testify. Okay? He may have been serious about his grant because the Highlanders, his regiment, would later settle in Nova Scotia. I think we're going to have some of these pictures coming up, okay? He fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill and influenced a famous painting about what else? Divided loyalties. Okay? Small was wealthy and gave his money to a man named John Reed, who was another opponent of the Green Mountain Boys in the Middlebury area. Okay? John Small had likely sold his holdings in Shaftsbury like everybody else did by the time of the ejectment trials, and therefore was not at Albany to defend them. New York Governor Cadwallader Colden reemerges to take the Vermont land regardless of the Crown's orders in 1769. So he returns as governor, and he worked with the Delancey family for months of lost salary as governor and repayment of losses during the Stamp Act riots. Okay? He now had a guaranteed salary. So this led to the survey and division of Delancey's Walloon-Sac patent, which overlaps into Bennington and was chartered in 1739. Bennington was chartered in 1749. No agent had testified before their lordships in favor of New Hampshire. In fact, Anglo-American politician William Samuel Johnson later advised Governor Benning Wentworth that because the Crown had taken away some of the colony's best land without any notice or hearing, New Hampshire had a very equitable ground to request a reconsideration of a point so interested to its well-being. So why did nobody ever stick up to New York? So that's one of the things I was trying to talk about in that paragraph. New York seemed to be getting its way in most instances at this time period. So the other states didn't get involved with the Vermont's and New York's land grant controversy. Okay, we're catching up here. There was a house owned by Ephraim Pierce where the unusual state line house built in 1800 now stands. Ephraim Pierce's house was supposed to have been built in 1794. Did you know that the front door of the state line house is in the back? It is in 2 states and in 3 counties. Okay? So an old and infrequently told story of Vermont's founding was about 2 or 3 different confrontations or standoffs with James Breckinridge and the Green Mountain Boys on Murphy Road in Bennington. Okay? New research suggests that the first confrontation happened at the state line house. These competitors knew where the lines were drawn. By stopping the surveyors here in New York, then prosecuted Breckinridge personally, disregarding the Bennington assertion of legal titles up to the 20-mile line, as drawn from Bennington, which staked the claim. Okay? In October 1769, New York surveyors came to run a line for that Walloomsac patent. First Breckinridge, then Samuel Robinson Jr. They were returning from Albany. They negotiated between those surveyors and our people. The New Yorkers repeatedly taunted them to stop them, saying things like, "Stop us or break our chain," because they were very upset with this survey. The Green Mountain Boys did stop them in 1769, which initiated the ejectment trials. Okay, so we're going back to the Waldo Tavern. So some of the people that came with, which settlers to Shaftsbury came from that Baptist church in Dover, New York with Ebenezer Cole. One of them was Samuel Waldo. He was the pastor of the Dover Baptists. His house was built in 1769 and it lasted until 1905. So it was right there on Route 7A, just north of the single pillar house in center Shaftsbury. A prayer meeting was held here during the Battle of Bennington. Oh, we're over to this. Okay. I can handle it. Isaiah Carpenter's house was built in 1765 or even 1762. Deep within the folds of New York's claim to future Vermont lies a second villain, besides James Breckinridge, who deserved no leniency because he did not have clean hands. There are 2 very different stories about what happened with Isaiah Carpenter. One, a very often told story, is that he settled on John Small's soldier's grant and evicted his tenant. There was also property damage, and he refused to have his land surveyed. He was not the only one. And even possibly stopped the surveyor. When John Monroe went to evict him, or really just serve papers, Carpenter threatened to blow his brains out. New research tells a different story. The Isaiah Carpenter was not on Major Small's soldier's grant or on any of the plots that Governor Moore assigned to John Small. There was no tenant is actually a fictional way to bring a lawsuit at the time. Ebenezer Cole testified in Albany court that Carpenter was on Small's land. Did he lie? Why? Carpenter was charged excessive fees for the survey and fictitious damages. So this was a way to win a case against those who were too poor to pay. In January of 1771, Carpenter was at home with 2 guns, one loaded with kidney beans. Monroe broke down the door to enter and then destroyed the roof, making the tenement of little value unlivable until repairs could happen in the spring. Carpenter would not quit the house until the roof was taken off, according to the James Duane narrative. Also at this time, Ebenezer Cole and Parker Cole, his son, led John Monroe through the woods from the Ebenezer Cole to arrest Silas Robinson on Harwood Hill. And Silas Robinson would spend a year in Albany jail. That's the view from Isaiah Carpenter's house. And you can see how he would know very much where he is in terms of the 20-mile line controversy and the various landmarks. It would have been a perfect vantage point for understanding where things were at the time. Okay, where do we go here? Past that. Go to the next slide. All right, that's the John Smalls Royal Highland Immigrants banner. And there's our Major John Small, who is the recipient of the main recipient of the Soldiers' Grant in Shaftsbury. And there's the painting of him at the Battle of Bunker Hill by Jonathan Trumbull, and it's symbolizing his divided loyalties, because this British soldier is reaching out to stop a grenadier from doing a fatal blow on a patriot there. Okay, there we go. How did Bennington lose in Albany court over James Breckinridge's house being within 17 miles of Hudson River when it has always been 22 miles from Hudson River? Ebenezer Cole testified that Carpenter was on Small's land, which he wasn't. They didn't have a plot map. They didn't have the plot map that I've just shown you. It would have been critical evidence for the trial. James Breckinridge may have taken a job or a bribe with New York and folded his case. He may have actually chosen to not pay the court fees to press the case. And we also know that Ethan Allen was bribed and given a horse at the ejectment trials. So, on July 18, 1771, mounted militia, lawyers, and the Albany mayor descended upon Murphy Road in Bennington to evict James Breckinridge. So here's a painting of that event, which is in the former Rutland post office. Okay. They found his house defended by the townsfolk and Breckinridge not present or the leader this time. The posse comitatus stayed at the Murphy Road Bridge while Monroe, Sheriff Tenek, and others had a parley with the Green Mountain Boys at Breckinridge's house. The 100 people refused to give up possession of the house, which would be accepting New York's jurisdiction. When the moment became tense, Sheriff Tenek tried to split the door with an axe, which was brought for that purpose. Here's a quote. And once the sheriff knocked with his hanger against the door, this deponent heard, as it were, cocking of firearms, and looking towards the north, which the door of the house faced, he saw several men standing in the posture of firing. The sheriff was actually stopped by one of his own men, William Pemberton, a mariner. He took a hold of the sheriff and prevented him from endeavoring to enforcing the said door. So this event is known as the birthplace of Vermont and was effectively the last real on-the-ground measure taken by New York to implement its jurisdiction. Were the Green Mountain Boys stubborn or intimidating, or was the New York militia's lack of resolve the real takeaway from this encounter? So who were some of these New York militia? Well, I've obtained some of these documents of the New York militia at the time, which very few historians have seen. Some of the names of the New York militia are Trumbull, Wright, Cole's son Parker, John Monroe, of course, Bliss Willoughby, Joseph Haviland, and Hazard Wilcox of Battle of Bennington fame. There was a victorious riot that occurred just after the Breckinridge standoff in Bennington. A Vermonter and a New Yorker had made an arrangement to share a contested plot. Samuel Gardner was active in many ways against the Vermonters' land claims. He also had slaves on Cross Hill Road, where a series of events happened over 2 weeks' time, culminating with the pulling down of John Monroe's house. Gardner may have lived where Kimberly Farms now is, which is right on the state line, of course, and Ichabod Cross's house may have been the old Hall House on Cross Hill Road there. Next slide. Okay, so we're back to that part where I was telling you about the men that came with Ebenezer Cole from Dover, New York. So this is known as the Peleg Cole House, or the Amaziah Martin House. It was built in 1769. It's also known as the Half-Stone House. Martin married Ebenezer Cole's oldest daughter, Rebecca, and he carved his initials AM in the ridgepole. And you can notice that this house is built similar, in a similar fashion to Ebenezer Cole's munitions house. Right, see if we're going to catch up to this part. All right. Bliss Willoughby was a loyalist. So here's a picture of George Whitefield. His sons and wife all died in 1771, somehow tragically, and he married Ebenezer Cole's cousin Rosanna in 1772. His house was in North Shaftsbury, not far from here, possibly 6151 Route 7A, the Carl Goodman House. Anyhow, between 1772 and 75 was the height of the Green Mountain Boys activity locally here. This concerned New Yorkers or other loyalists living in the state. These years were tense. The Vermonters had gained some measure of stability after standing up to the land grabbers, yet the loyalists were still in place and well supported. The Green Mountain Boys were worn out or forced some people to flee, okay? It was like the old Western movies. You guys might know the Remember Baker capture. This is one of these examples of these warnings out on either side, okay? So here's a quote from Benjamin Buck, a Shaftsbury resident, so we know where Buck Hill Road is. His house site is also up on Buck Hill Road. He called at the house of Captain Stephen Fay in Bennington, the Catamount Tavern, for some refreshment for himself and a horse. Ethan Allen was there, and he said, "You are a damn bastard of old Monroe's. We shall make a hell of his house, and in turn burn him in it, and every son of a bitch that will take his part. It is no wonder to suppose that you are of that principle, for old Cole lives on one side of you, and old Willoughby on the other." So you can see there were some tough times for people with different loyalties in the Bennington area. In the spring of 1772, New York made that grant to Ebenezer Cole, so they re-granted the pretended town of Shaftsbury as the Ebenezer Cole Tract, okay? At this time, the Vermonters were starting to expect an invasion of redcoats under the new New York governor, William Tryon. So here's a quote from John Monroe. "However, if this Bennington was well dressed, I presume all the rest will fall, of course, and that government will be restored to peace." So the tensions were high, and history says that Ebenezer Cole and others, Bliss Willoughby, fled to New York City at this time. And there was a meeting with Governor Tryon, and the New York Committee's ruling brought complete relief. And this is the event that I referred to as the "and they were New Yorkers again" event, which of course they went back and forth many times with their jurisdiction, but it did not last. And it was at that meeting that they're discussing how to return people to their homes, okay? So this means Cole and Willoughby. One more thing about Amaziah Martin. The first church in Shaftsbury considered a difficulty in 1774. Amaziah Martin, from the Half-Stone House, and others had assisted the mob against the Yorkers. There was forgiveness on the matter. And so does this show that the first Shaftsbury church was a Yorker, a loyalist church, meaning the members had been more favorable to New York titles? Okay, so here we are. We're getting into some stories about coercion and bribery and corruption in colonial times. So here's a quote. "For weeks, rumors were rife that the ministry in London was planning to bribe New Yorkers to remain loyal to the crown. And unlike any province, New York had a powerful, active, and reliable loyalist front. Cadwallader Colgan regularly informed his London superiors that the radical frenzy was an urban aberration, fostered by a relative handful of the lower sort. So it was natural that stories of financial and other inducements to strengthen loyalist ties should circulate. Coffee houses in London were full of such talk. So were the provincial newspapers. James Duane wrote to New York's Attorney General John Tabor Kemp, saying that he had it that Kemp had assured the ministry that if it supplied him with £100,000, he would undertake to buy off all the patriots in the province. General Gage, it was said, was armed with a rich purse to offer leading colonials, especially those in New York. A Londoner wrote to Governor Tryon, soon to be returning to New York, wrote that Governor Tryon has the command of money to bribe, and that Major Philip Skene had boasted to the ministry that he could purchase all the members of the Continental Congress. According to this letter writer, the ministerial plan is undoubtedly to reduce every American to the most degraded state of bondage and servitude, and to use force and violence in New England, and bribery and other artifices to divide the rest of the colonies from the common cause. So who was it who had revolted from the crown? In a letter to his friend Philip Schuyler, William Smith posed an interesting question, reminding Schuyler that Colden was granting lands in the face of instructions to the contrary, okay? Smith said that he had been offered land between Lake Champlain and the Connecticut River for a mere 18 pence per acre. He intended to sport away 1,000 pounds, as I suppose it will be the last chance. As for Schuyler, he should apply soon, for the next packet may close the present scene in which the king's property is to be disposed of against his will. Let this all be a secret. Okay, the Amos Huntington Jr. House was built in 1788. It's known as the Honeymoon House. There's some heart-shaped openings in the keeping room door. This house has an unusual finished basement with large marble slabs. I grew up in the Amos Huntington Senior House, which was built in 1782, which is just up the road there. Okay. Amos Huntington was a captain in the Shaftsbury militia, and he was captured at the Battle of Hubbardton by the German troops. He spent over a year in captivity, both in Canada and in New York City, when he was finally exchanged. The Simon and Elijah Bonham House, built in 1795. Okay, so there's several houses in the area related to the Bonham family. It has an underground passage to a barn on the east side. Sarah Bonham was the fiancée of Justice Sherwood, former Vermonter, who is now with the British. Just days before the battle, as 1,200 enemy troops approached town, and when they were in Cambridge, Justice rode over and visited Sarah in Shaftsbury. Okay, the British are going to attack towards Bennington, believing 300 or 400 men are defending the town. This was from Justice. Okay, how did he not notice or hear anything about John Stark's 1,200 New Hampshire soldiers who had just moved through Shaftsbury days earlier? The British would be halted in North Hoosick because they were outnumbered. Okay, they would request reinforcements, and the battle happened 2 days later. The reinforcement didn't make it to the battlefield on time, and the first group was defeated with 700 captured. Well, the reinforcements were also defeated the same day. Okay, that's the Battle of Bennington. This is known as the White Pillar or the Harlow Huntington House, built in 1758. The barn was once used as one of the earlier churches by Thomas Madison. His initials are carved in the beams, that barn in the picture. It dates to 1767. The Green Mountain Boys under Seth Warner were in Manchester when Bennington was attacked. They marched to town, some staying in Shaftsbury, using the now recently fallen barn behind the single pillar house. The barn had been known as the oldest structure in Shaftsbury. The single pillar house is just south of the Waldo Tavern site in Center Shaftsbury. Okay, so both towns, Shaftsbury and Bennington, had approximately 500 residents at the time of the Battle of Bennington. Okay, so Parker Cole was presumed to be the main source of evidence that Shaftsbury was fully patriotic during the battle and the war, and that the Shaftsbury Munitions House was full of Continental supplies. It's not so. So Parker Cole was in the New York militia and would have been helping the British. He did comply with an order from the Council of Safety to supply leather for the shoes for Herrick's Rangers shortly after the battle. This may have been goodwill and faith, as the council was jailing and banishing many other local loyalists. He did become a patriot and helped the cause like the majority of Shaftsbury residents had already been doing. I would say that the leadership in Shaftsbury was loyalist, but the town was, most people in town were neutral or having different opinions about the situation. But most of the residents of Shaftsbury fought as patriots in the Revolutionary War. Okay, so we're still talking about the Battle of Bennington, and here's just a little map of the objectives of the British. Okay, so they came to Bennington, they're attacking for supplies, okay? James Breckinridge, from the state line, he was caught red-handed. Many others were assisting. They gathered supplies at his farm for Colonel Baum on Murphy Road in Bennington. There was also 4 horses belonging to John Monroe. Joseph Haviland of North Bennington had just been arrested after going over to the enemy and making promises for considerable supplies. So we have a group of people that we're talking about that may have made some significant promises to the British, okay? try again. Okay, trying to get things to match up a little bit here. So after the Battle of Bennington, Colonel Baum and the Loyalist leader, Francis Pfister, are buried in Shaftsbury. So they died of their wounds 2 days after the Battle of Bennington. Tory David Matthews fought as a patriot in the battle, but in the New York militia, okay? The State Line House is rumored to have been built using British gold that was sent with Baum to buy loyalty. Francis Pfister was a British Army officer on half pay who settled in Hoosick Falls, where the Hoosick School now is. This was a part of the same Thomas Gage plan for retired soldiers in the area, just like John Monroe and John Small's presence in Shaftsbury. Okay, so there's an old painted marker for the grave site. Now there's a granite marker there on Route 67. Okay, across from the old Stark paper mill site. And that's a Leroy Williams painting of Baum and Pfister being brought into the house. Okay. And that's another painting of the house, which is, of course, now long gone. Okay. Who was Parker Cole? And how has the Shaftsbury Munitions House been related to the Battle of Bennington? Ebenezer's son is mentioned as providing leather for Herrick's Rangers after the Battle of Bennington. This may have led many scholars to thinking that the Shaftsbury Munitions House was for the Patriots and a part of the Continental Storehouse that the British were attacking for at the Battle of Bennington. Okay? We went over the slide, but William Williams was the leader in Bennington and ranking officer after the Battle of Bennington. Okay, so he's in town handling the captured troops that were in Bennington for 2 days after the Battle of Bennington. And William Williams is a legacy of the Williams family claims to Bennington. He settled in Wilmington, and he is known for being involved with the line of forts which were between Massachusetts and Vermont, which staked the claim for New Englanders for the land that would become Vermont. Go back a couple of slides. Yeah, keep going. All right. What is the story behind the Parker Cole House built across the road from the Munitions House on Buck Hill Road? It is rumored to have cost $17,000 to build. It is built of dressed stone from the site. Could this represent Major John Small's money? Could this be a Rensselaer farm with slaves? Could Ebenezer Cole's sons have built it? It's quite a monumental feat, and it's amazing that we still have this building when we don't have any similar buildings related to the Revolutionary War in Bennington. Okay? So it's similar to the Munitions House. The basement apartment was petitioned the same as the first floor of the house. There are two front doors for some reason on the right, and it's reported to have once had a flat roof. So it's possible that it may have been a one-story building for a while. You can sort of see evidence of that, okay? Also, after the Revolutionary War, there was found a redcoat skeleton in the basement.
That's forward.
Oh, yeah.
Back or forward?
Forward, yeah.
Okay.
Hey! After Ethan Allen returned from captivity, he was motivated to expunge the area of Loyalist supporters. He banished 17 wicked Tories with nominal support from the Council of Safety. Foremost among those banished were James Breckinridge and Ebenezer Cole. Many of the 17 were taken to Albany, but Breckinridge and Cole received reprieves from the council for years. None of those Tories had ever received trial by jury. Later, both Breckinridge and then Bliss Willoughby were banished. Tory Willoughby was fined and encouraged to leave in 1780, and his son had gone over to the enemy. So a funny line could be that Ethan Allen could take Fort Ticonderoga, but he never could banish old Ebenezer Cole in Shaftsbury. James Breckinridge returned to Bennington when all the Tories were essentially pardoned, only to do much more spying and behind-the-scenes work, okay? His effort at this time from Bennington may have been instrumental in forming the Federalist opposition to the Allen Party and delayed Vermont statehood until 1791. Okay, the famous secret tunnel of Shaftsbury. Was it a hideout of the Queen's Loyal Rangers and Loyalist officials? Did this tunnel foil Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys? So there's a picture of Helen Olney in a little tunnel that goes between the cider barn and the basement of the Parker Coal House. Okay, Benjamin Cole, the third son of Ebenezer Cole. He's related to a story about Anne Story. So Anne Story was a patriot woman who was living in Salisbury along the Otter Creek in a cave along the creek, okay? And she's assisting the Green Mountain Boys deep within enemy territory. Okay, we're going back a little bit in time. Just before the Battle of Bennington, 22 Tories led by Benjamin Cole were caught by local militia heading for enemy lines in Moncton. Anne's Story was found in her cave by a passing Tory. She sent her son to alert the militia, and the militia came out and arrested the Tories, who would spend 2.5 days in Brandon and then were sent to Ticonderoga. This is just a picture of the Governor Galusha House, of course, where the Shaftsbury Historical Society's home base is. This is two houses north of the original Galusha House. This house was built in 1783. The original Galusha House has meat hooks which are considered related to the Revolutionary War. So in 1780, there was a new supply system for the state's troops. Before that, there was a Continental Supply Depot in Bennington with Continental supplies sent by George Washington to help our troops, okay, and supply other troops in the area. That was taken away in 1779, so there's a new quota system for the state's troops. Each town is going to supply the supplies for their troops that are in the field, okay? So the names associated with the supply system in 1780 are Waldo, Galusha, Freegeth Cole, Willoughby, Ichabod Cross, who we have all talked about, okay? So there are many Galusha houses in town, just like there are several Bottom, Madison, Huntington, Fuller, and Cole family houses. Where was the original house on some of the lots I discussed? This is something for further research and study. Sometimes they are incorporated into the existing houses or are a smaller addition, often in the back. Anything left? Just another picture of the Galusha House. Okay. There's a picture of John Monroe. He was the leader of a dubious raid on Ballston Spa in 1780. Okay, where he led some Indians down and many were killed. So he was very much a dangerous person for the Green Mountain Boys to have in town, and he would continue to be a British soldier attacking New York and Vermont frontier from Canada. Next. All right. So, what is the origin of the idea that Shaftsbury was settled by people from Rhode Island, more specifically the Maple Hill area? Well, I think Shaftsbury was settled by various groups of people from all the New England states. And there was a group of people who actually did settle the Maple Hill area from Rhode Island. But in my research, I found quite a correlation between the evangelist religions and Rhode Island culture. So that it's possible, I'm thinking it's possible, that maybe people thought that the Shaftsbury was settled by people from Rhode Island culturally because they had a different religion, okay? So there's plenty of evidence that religious differences, slavery, and border warfare were also significant causes of the Revolutionary War. Not just merchants' rights and colonial ports and taxation, which still grabs the historical headlines. The split between Shaftsbury and Bennington may have cost Vermont its future at the Battle of Bennington if a few things had gone differently. Okay, so what we learned here today is that Loyalists were doing what was right for them, and that the colonies were each different in many ways. So, I think I've proven that Ebenezer Cole's house was possibly built with New York money because he's working for New York at the time, It's a still existing building. There's still 4 existing coal buildings in Shaftsbury, including the coal hall, which was built by Uriah Cole in 1834. The town of Shaftsbury was for about 3 years effectively regranted to Ebenezer Cole, who was a major opponent of the Green Mountain Boys in the land grants controversy. So it would seem that Shaftesbury's divided loyalties were a major obstacle to Vermont statehood. At the Battle of Bennington, the loyalists of Shaftesbury and Bennington were offering the British considerable help, and they were caught at the Breckenridge Farm in Murphy Road. And many of them were dealt with by the Council of Safety in the years after that. I hope I've shown you a bunch of the houses around Shaftesbury and how they related to the Revolutionary War. And thank you for listening to my presentation. Thank you for your time. Do you have any questions out there? Yes, sir.
Done a lot of research on John Monroe and his land holdings
Excellent.
in Shaftesbury Hollow. I'm a forester by trade, been living in town since the late 70s.
Cool.
Interesting that John Monroe was Sergeant Major for all the military officers and was actually with them in that survey party that laid these lots out. It's also interesting to me that the original grants made in Shaftsbury by Ben Wentworth or whoever, you can on the ground you can actually see where they overlay.
Amazing,
And,
yeah.
and a lot of stuff lines up in Shaftsbury Hollow. My question is, from my research, and I could be wrong, the Republic of Vermont seized a lot of property and sold them at auction to finance the Republic of Vermont before it became a state.
Mm-hmm.
John Monroe's property in Shaftsbury was the only one. There was 2 other small takings, but here we have reputedly Coles and some other people that were very strong loyalists, but Monroe's property was the only one seized. And I've been through all the books from the Historical Society, and that's the only property I can see. Here, what I'd really like to find is the cellar hole for John Monroe's property. And I looked and been all over that whole side of town. Why weren't more of the properties seized by the Republic of Vermont? Cole's property, some of the ones up on Buckhill.
I think that's a very interesting question. I think it was a problem for the Bennington Council of Safety to initiate such ejectments within such a close-knit community. And Ebenezer Cole had actually, going back in time, had helped to confirm some of Bennington's grants without payment of fees. So they must have on some level felt that they owed him some part of their existence there. Yes, so that is unusual, and I'm glad that you pointed that out. That only John Monroe, the loyalist in Shaftesbury Hall, may have been banished. I believe his wife stuck around for a couple of years after he was.
Yeah.
That's part of the story. His
Yeah,
wife
she was run out of town, or run back to Albany with one person helping her, and I think 5 kids. I could be wrong on that number of kids.
right, one of those deals where the Council of Safety gave her 1 cow.
Run cow.
Yeah.
1 cow. Supposedly she buried and had some silver with her that bought her way to Albany. She was turned out by her parents. Bought her way through enemy lines back to Montreal. One thing I found real interesting also is they were, Monroe, his wife, their family were prolific writers. And
I didn't know that.
a lot of their stuff, and COVID got in the way, or he was granted land by the King of England in Ontario. And that's on my list of places to go to the museum up there. There's nothing online.
Yep, so like most loyalists, John Monroe's holdings in Vermont were never upheld by the King of England, so he lost all his assets.
He refused to uphold.
Yeah.
Right.
Any other questions out there? Bill?
Bob, you mentioned that Warner's men, on the way to the battle, stopped overnight in a barn behind the one-pillar house.
Correct.
what's the source for that?
I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
Yep, so it'd certainly be in my notes. Yeah.
I've heard that they stayed north of Bennington, a mile or so. I thought it was Harwood Hill, but
I think my understanding is that Stark's troop stayed on Harwood Hill, and that the Green Mountain Boys were in Shaftsbury
okay,
right before the battle.
thanks.
Any other questions? Thank you, everyone. I think we have just a couple more comments. Stick around and enjoy the refreshments and goodies that have been brought. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. So again, thank you all for coming. We have refreshments in the back before you leave. We did our best to advertise this event. We used various social media. Just quickly, how many people heard about it on Front Porch Forum?
How many people were?
Heard about the event on Front Porch Forum?
2, 3.
Yeah.
Not too many. Facebook? Okay, anything else?
We the people in
Paul,
charge.
we the people? Mostly word of mouth?
An email chain.
And the email chain. All right, from the kids.
library.
Okay. All right, we're just trying to keep it out there. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks again. Thank you, Bob.